Well, to the Middle East now, where the devastating war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza means persistent dangers for journalists who are trying to cover the conflict. Recent figures from the Committee to Protect Journalists show Palestinian journalists made up the majority of all reporters killed worldwide in the past year. Now, since Hamas's October 7th terror attacks, 83 Palestinian journalists and 2 Israeli journalists have been killed in the conflict. Within Gaza, it's now almost exclusively Palestinians reporting on the war on the ground. Israel has refused to let foreign journalists in to report independently there. All those reporting from within Gaza are doing so under extremely difficult conditions. Well, for more now, I'm joined by Jodie Ginsberg. She's the CEO of the Committee to Protect Journalists and joins me from New York. Jodie, it's good to have you with us. Let's talk about this conflict. This conflict is just, 3 months old? And in terms of being dangerous to journalists, how does it compare to other conflicts where journalists have tried to get to the truth?
This is the deadliest conflict for journalists that the Committee to Protect Journalists has ever documented. We've been doing this work for more than 30 years. More journalists died in the first 10 weeks of the Israel-Gaza war than have ever died, certainly since we've been doing this work in a single country over an entire year. The intensity, the numbers is absolutely unprecedented.
Your organization, we know, investigates the deaths of journalists in Gaza. I don't have to tell you, it's very difficult to verify any information that's coming out of the Gaza Strip. How do you make sure that the data you're collecting, that it's accurate?
It is extremely difficult. The sorts of things that we would normally rely on, being able to speak to families, being able to speak to colleagues, is extremely challenging because families are being killed, colleagues are being killed. Nevertheless, we take the same approach that we would with any other situation. We make sure that we have at least 2 sources of information for any of the journalists that we document. We speak to friends, we speak to families, we do research online that looks at their outputs to make sure that our information is as accurate as possible. And of course, it's a war. Information comes to light over time, and we update our information as we get it.
What do you say to the allegations that are coming from Israel that some of these journalists are militants? I mean, do you believe that they've actually been targeted by Israeli forces?
Well, we have yet to see any credible evidence that the journalists that the Israelis have said are actually militants, are actually terrorists, are such. Last year, before this war started, the Committee to Protect Journalists produced a report called Deadly Pattern, which looked at the killings of largely Palestinian journalists by Israeli forces over the past 22 years. And we found that 20 journalists had been killed, and in not a single case had anyone been held accountable. And what we saw, in fact, was a pattern in which quite often Israel was accused journalists of being terrorists, of being militants, but never produced any evidence. And that remains the case in this war, too.
Israel says that its army cannot guarantee the safety of journalists. How can journalists then, how can they do their job without risking their lives?
Journalists in Gaza cannot do their jobs without risking their lives. Nowhere in Gaza is safe. Journalists are doing absolutely what we would expect journalists to do, covering a war. They're looking at the aftermath of bombings by going to hospitals, and then we see hospitals bombed, or they're going to refugee camps to look at the effects of displacement. Those have also been bombed. There isn't a place for journalists to be safe in the current environment. But it's absolutely imperative that we recognize that journalists are civilians and must be treated as such. So they must never be targeted.
Jodie Ginsberg with the Committee to Protect Journalists. Jodie, we appreciate your time and your input tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.